We're going to be in Ecclesiastes 11:7 through 12:14 today, so you are more than welcome to turn there if you so desire. I just played it cool, because that's what you do. You play it cool. You see, the temptation would be to spill out all your guts, to give all the details, to leave no stone unturned, but no, that's not what you do. You play it cool. That's what you do when you come home from school and you walk in the door and your mom says, "So, how was your day, sweetie?" You face the ground, you put your hands in your pockets, you shrug your shoulders, you say, "It was all right." Of course, I think today she could probably see past my normal disguise. Because today was certainly more than In fact, I think if she pushed a little bit harder, I probably would have broke and told her absolutely everything, because the truth of the matter is, today was a pretty awesome day. Today, we went on a field trip. I know, oh, yippity day, a field trip, but no. This was no ordinary field trip. This was not a journey down to the local gardens or to the local shepherd's operation. No, today we went to the palace. Not just any palace. We went to the palace. As we walked through the gates into the open courtyard, we saw loads of fruit-bearing trees. The giant structure housed fountains and ponds and pools. The pillars of the palace of the Forest of Lebanon, they seemed to stretch to the sky, and the halls seemed to go on forever. There we saw the temple of the Lord our God. We could see in the distance the very residence of the King himself. And although our teacher tried to shield our eyes, it was impossible not to see the loads of chicks this dude kept around. This guy had it made. I remember thinking to myself, oh, if I could only accomplish a fraction of what our great king has accomplished, I would consider my life counted worthy. Indeed, everything to this point had been absolutely amazing. But nothing could compare to what was about to happen. As we approached the throne room, the mere honor of seeing the judgment seat of the king would have made my day. But my heart could not prepare me for the coming sight. As the giant wooden doors swung open, we saw there, sitting in the middle of the room, him, Solomon, the king. My fellow students and I, we couldn't help but stand in complete silence of the moment. And as each emotional step added onto the next, we saw the king as he gestured that we come in and sit at his feet. It was absolutely amazing. And there may have been 100 people gathered in that room today, both old and young alike. But as I came in and sat within arm's reach of the Lord's anointed, I felt as though I was the only person in the room. I felt I was an apprentice to the king, a protege. I felt as if he called me in to impart his life's wisdom directly on to me. And the whole assembly stood completely silent, waiting for the teacher to begin. And we leaned forward in anticipation of his first words. But none of us could have expected what happened next. As he surveyed the assembly and he looked down on us, young men, in the prime of our lives and ready to take on the world, he whispered in the faintest voice, "Meaningless. Utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless." The air escaped the room. The youthful vitality that permeated amongst all of us was completely shaken as we listened to the words of our King. Possessions, he would say, are meaningless. A lofty goal from a man whose house took 13 years to build. Wisdom, he would say, is a mere chasing after the wind. A pretty big statement from someone who was considered wise enough to be our King and to issue verdicts of judgment from the very seat he was sitting on. Now, I have read his writings. I have read his beautiful poems and his words of wisdom, and quite frankly, they mean a great deal to my family, but meaningless, he says. I became restless. I began looking around, and I saw the same distraught view on all of my fellow students' faces. But I looked at my teacher, who just sat there, quietly. As the tenets of wisdom and knowledge are attacked. I suppose these are the words of the King. It probably wouldn't be that wise to interject. So we listened. The King continued. He was speaking of work, of investment, of wisdom. He spoke of monetary gain. He spoke of the oppression of the weak. And as he went on and on, I must declare, in my state of ADD, my mind may have wandered a little bit. Because he had been speaking a while, my attention had wavered. But it wasn't long before the words of the King brought me back. "You who are young," he said, "be happy while you are young." My ears perked up. I looked over the shoulder of the person next to me, jotting notes to see exactly what I had missed. Light is sweet, and it pleases the eyes to see the sun. That's pretty good stuff. I was pretty impressed with the notes that my friend was taking. I felt compelled to read on. "However many years you may live, let them enjoy them all. You who are young, be happy while you are young, and let your heart give you joy in the days of your youth." Now that is what I'm talking about. Follow the ways of your heart, and whatever your eye sees. This I can get on board with. Finally, something I can latch onto. Something that isn't a mere chasing after the wind. Enjoy life. Live it up. Spare myself no joy. Now look. I'm not talking about going after hundreds of wives and concubines. But come on, look at me. I could go for 3 or 4. Right? Live it up. Smoke them if you got them. Enjoy life. Of course, he would continue. But for all these things, God will bring you into judgment. Now, of course, that's what a teenage kid wants to hear. You know, he had me going there. For a moment, I thought that something wasn't a mere chasing after the wind. For once, I thought there was something that I could latch onto. For once, I thought something would be worthy. If it was anything, it had to be youth. But of course, what does the King say about youth and vigor? You guessed it. Meaningless. I was pretty tempted to space out again. But then he began speaking of things greater than me. He began speaking of things that weren't in the physical realm, but in the spiritual. Remember your Creator, he said. I couldn't help but latch on to that because things started to come together. The words he was saying began to make sense. Remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the days of trouble come, and the years approach when you will say, I find no joy in them. Before the sun and the light and the moon and the stars go dark, and the clouds return after the rain. When the keeper of the house trembles and the strong men stoop. When the grinders cease because they are few. And those looking through the windows grow dim. when the doors of the streets are closed and the sound of grinding fades, when people rise up to the sounds of birds, but their songs grow faint. When people become afraid of heights and dangers in the streets, when the almond tree blossoms and the grasshopper drags itself, and desire no longer is stirred, then people go to the dust from where they came and return to God. Remember Him. When the silver cord is severed and the golden bowl is broken, before the pitcher is shattered at the spring, when the wheel broken at the well, and the dust returns to the ground it came from, and the spirit returns to God who gave it. Mind blown. Can kind of put things into perspective. This life, my body, it's fleeting. Youth, temporary. The stars turn dark, the body ages, the hair turns gray. And we're forced to ask ourselves, what have I accomplished? What have I gained? My mother always used to tell me the story of Job, a man who had all the wealth of Solomon and yet lost it all because God was testing his faithfulness. And I will never forget the moral of the story. And that is that in feast and famine, in wealth and poverty, we remember God. I remember Mom talking about days in Jerusalem when all of the people prayed to one God, our God, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob, the God who delivered us out of Egypt, who brought us into this land, the God who created us. Remember your Creator, he says. I'll be honest. This was a really hard lesson to sit through. Wealth, wisdom, glory, fame, they all seemed honorable goals going in. And yet, there I sat at the feet of one who had all of this and more. Tell me those pursuits are pure vanity. But something did move in me that day. Because when I look at my hands, my young hands, I see tools. I have always seen tools. They work, they build, they create. But until this day, they have always worked for me. And sitting there, listening to the king speak, I had to ask a question of myself. What can I accomplish with these hands that hasn't been accomplished before? Can I build a house as great as Solomon's? Can I gather the wealth of all the kings of the land? And even if I could, would they not just turn to dust after I was gone? But if not for my own sake, for whom do my hands work? Fortunately, I stayed awake for the end of the king's speech. Because not only was the teacher wise, but he also imparted this knowledge onto us. He pondered and searched and set in order many proverbs. And the teacher did search to find just the right words. And what he said was upright and true, and I believe it. Because now all has been heard, and the conclusion of the matter is this: fear God and obey His commandments. This is the duty of all mankind. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including everything hidden, both good and bad. Oh, Solomon. What a clever conclusion. It starts to make sense to me now. It ties a bow on the whole package, because while sitting there, I must have heard the phrase "under the sun" probably a dozen times. But not until this point did I get it. Because I thought going in, the king was going to tell me how to live my life. I thought I would hear wisdom on how to live day to day. I thought he would teach me how to be successful in my endeavors and prosperous. And indeed, his wisdom does lend itself to that. But the crux of the message, the point to be ascertained, the conclusion of the matter, is that life under the sun is indeed meaningless. That is true. But what is more true is that a life lived under and for God can be nothing but meaningful. As God's people, we need to seek first God's kingdom, God's domain. We need to look up to the one who created us, because God is meaning, God is the solution, God is the reason, God is the reason for life, God is life, and apart from God, there is nothing but destruction. And yet, as I sit in my room and I stare out my window, I can't help but see the disconnect. I look up at the hill not far from my house, and there I see an Asherah pole. It's only one of many idols that God's people have brought into His city. The fear of God is not in His people. His commandments are not kept. And if the words of Solomon ring true, then judgment is coming. Dark days are ahead for His people. His people, His creation, His beloved, are wandering around aimlessly in their sin with no one showing them the error of their ways. Maybe after all, my youth isn't meaningless. Maybe my youth and vigor and vitality does have purpose. But no, not to collect wealth and possessions for myself, but to use my energy and my vitality to bring God's people to repentance. While I am young, while I am able, perhaps I need to change my outlook. Perhaps I need to cease living for myself and begin living for God. Perhaps. Perhaps today is not the day to put my hands in my pockets, to shrug my shoulders and just play it cool. Perhaps. Hey, Mom! I want to tell you what I learned today.